She didn't come back angry. That's the part nobody talks about. That's the part that still makes my hands do that thing. That involuntary, embarrassing thing where they shake a little when I try to fill out a report, and I have to set the pen down and pretend I'm thinking. Sergeant Dara Voss was left in a kill zone with a busted radio, 2 rounds in her secondary magazine, and 6 men retreating without her. Those 6 men had reasons. They all had reasons. In a firefight, our reasons multiply like bacteria. Fear reasons, command structure reasons. She would have wanted us to reasons. I've heard all of them. I wrote all of them down because I write everything down. It's my thing. 3 notebooks since deployment, plus ballpoint ink, not gel, because gel smears when your hands sweat, and my hands always sweat. 72 hours she pretty much was out there. 72, I mean hours. And when she came back, she was carrying her own kit, and theirs. I need you TBH. To understand something before I tell you what happened in that field, what she did, what it cost her and what it cost the rest of us to watch a person rebuild herself from nothing in a place designed to erase people. I need you to understand that the Army doesn't produce heroes. Sort of, it produces situations. Plus, and pretty much sometimes, not often, not reliably, not in any way you can plan for or train for or write a doctrine around. Sometimes a person rises so completely into a situation that the two become indistinguishable. Dara Voss didn't survive the field. She became it. And then she walked back out and handed 6 men their gear. And she didn't say a single word. And that silence has lived inside me like a stone ever since. This is what happened. And the radio call came in at 0347, and I was already awake because I'm always already awake. And which my therapist back home, a woman with a wind chime collection that makes me want to eat glass, says is a trauma response, and which I prefer to think of as professionalism. I'd my notebook open, I'd bad coffee, I'd the particular exhaustion that doesn't feel like tiredness so much as weight, like someone had packed wet sand into the cavity behind my eyes and forgotten to remove it. I was logging pretty much the previous evening's patrol data when Corporal Esteban Ruiz's voice crackled through the handset, doing something I'd never heard it do in 14 months of working with him. Breaking. Plus not crying. Esteban Ruiz did not cry. He actually was 24 years old and built like something you'd pour concrete around to make a foundation, and he once ate a protein bar while a mortar round took out the vehicle 16 feet to his left. Not crying, breaking. Plus, the way a voice breaks when it's trying to report something the mouth doesn't want to form into words. Voss is still in grid Echo 9er. I set my pen down. Say again, Corporal. She's... The egress was compromised, sir. The South Channel took fire, and Sergeant Halden made the call to, is she alive? A pause that lasted 3 years. She was when we pulled back. I picked my pen up. I wrote 0347, which Voss. TBH, Echo 9er. Status unknown. And then I sat there looking at what I'd written. And the thing about writing things down is that sometimes it doesn't help at all. Sometimes you write a fact, and the fact just sits there looking at you like a wound. Grid, kind of. Echo 9er was a Soviet-era grain processing facility that had been repurposed 3 times since the 90s. Militia depot, aid distribution point, militia depot again. The walls were corrugated metal sheeting over a poured concrete skeleton. And the layout was a floor plan designed by someone who hated right angles and loved ambush geometry. 3 entrances, 8 partial cover positions. 2 functional exits, basically, if you knew which section of the eastern wall had rusted through enough to breach, which our team knew because Voss herself had logged it during the recon sweep 4 days prior. She had a way of logging things, thorough in a way that made my own notation habits look like grocery lists. And I'd read her field notes during the planning phase and thought, this woman maps the world like she's afraid it will change when she isn't looking. I would think about that later, which at 0347, what I thought was, 6 soldiers had retreated and left their squad leader behind in a building where an unknown number of hostile combatants were repositioning, and when I found out who had made that call, I was going to staple them to a wall using their own documentation, metaphorically. I was going to file paperwork so thorough and so devastating that they'd feel it in their personnel file for the rest of their working lives. I think I was very calm. I'm always, very calm when I want to commit crimes. The debrief happened at 0530 in the command tent, which smelled like look, diesel, and the particular despair of a cot that has absorbed too many nights of bad sleep. 6 men, which seated, not looking at each other, which told me everything I needed to know about whether they thought they'd made the right call. Sergeant First Class Dane Halden sat at the end of the row, and Halden he wasn't a bad soldier. That's the honest accounting. He was 37, capable, decorated, and he had made a decision in a building full of shooting and smoke and the specific cognitive implosion that happens when your radio operator goes down in the first 30 seconds, and your squad leader is somewhere in the structure and you can't see her, and the exit's taking fire. He had made the decision that the majority of the unit surviving was better than the unit staying. The math wasn't wrong. The math was the problem. "She told me to move," Halden said, which his voice was flat. Flat in the way that voices go when a person has been saying something to themselves so many times it's worn smooth. "She said, 'Get them out, Dane.' Those were her words. So I did." "She was giving you a fire command," I said. "Not honestly, a permission slip." He looked at the table. I looked at the table too because there wasn't thing useful in either of our faces. Private First Class Amara Ose, youngest in the room, sat at the far end with his knuckles pressed against his mouth. He'd been in country 11 weeks. He had the look of someone who has just discovered that the stories people tell about war leave certain parts out. The parts, that don't have clean narratives. The parts where you retreat and it's the logical choice. It's also the worst thing you will ever do, and both of those things are equally and completely true. I wrote it all down. Plus every word, every silence. In every specific way each man held his body when he described the moment he passed through the exit, and Voss did not. I've 60 pages of that debrief in Notebook 2. I've never read them again, which the official position at 0600 on day 1 was MIA, Rescue Operation Pending. Which meant we didn't have the personnel to go back in yet, and the hostile activity in the grid was still elevated, and we were constructing a tactical picture that would allow us to extract her without compounding the situation. The unofficial position in the pit of my gut where I keep things I don't write down was 72 hours is a long time. The facility had no water source. Whatever she'd been carrying on her person, 2 mags, a field kit, a radio, that Esteban confirmed had been taking damage since the first contact. That was her inventory. That, for what it's worth, was what she had. That and whatever she could find. I want to tell you about Dara Voss because this story doesn't make sense without her being a real person. Real people resist the summarizing impulse, which means I've to be careful here. I've to resist my own notebook brain that wants to reduce her to data points. She was 31. I had a younger brother named Marcus, who was studying marine biology and called her every Sunday, and she complained about these calls constantly while clearly needing them more than oxygen. She basically had a habit, and this is the specific kind of detail that gets lodged in the memory, of tapping the top of her helmet with 2 fingers before entering a structure. Not superstition, she said once. Calibration. She tapped to remind herself that the space between her ears was still running, and that she was choosing to walk through a door and not just lurching toward it. She tapped before every entry. She had a voice that didn't do soft. Not because she was hard, but because she had learned, somewhere along the way that predates my knowledge of her, That softness in certain registers gets interpreted as uncertainty, and uncertainty in her position was a liability she couldn't afford. Actually, so she was precise, economical. Her squad called her GPS behind her back, not as a joke. It's exactly more as the kind of nickname that starts as an observation and ends as a compliment. She was also underneath all of that, the kind of tired that doesn't show. I knew because I'm the same kind. Plus, you learn to recognize it. The way a person moves when they're running on decision-making and willpower and the specific armor of being too busy to fall apart. You can see it in the small margins. And the way she'd close her eyes for one half-second longer than a blink before answering a question that required something from her. She was in that facility for 72 hours. And sort of whatever she was before she went in, she reorganized herself in there, the way a river reorganizes the scene, which not violently, inevitably. Day 1 passed without contact, no signal, and no movement at the perimeter that suggested an attempt at egress. The hostile force, we were calling them Vantage, and their own name for the militia cell operating through the grid corridor, had consolidated in the facility's eastern section, which our reconnaissance drone confirmed at 1400 with thermal imaging. 4 warm bodies in the east, moving, organized, for what it's worth. 1 thermal signature in the facility's sublevel, still, which she was in the crawl space below the processing floor. I looked at the imaging data for 45 minutes, trying to determine what still meant. Whether still meant hiding or still meant, I wrote 1400, thermal confirms, Voss, sublevel, stationary. Then I put a period after stationary, and then I sat with the period for a while. Stationary could mean sleeping. It could mean planning. It could mean she'd done the calculation and decided that moving was a worse option than waiting, that the geometry of the facility made stillness the right tactical choice, and that she was running an equation in her head about enemy movement patterns and structural cover, and she had arrived at not yet. That was what I chose to believe, not because I was naive and because I'd read 60 pages of her field notes, and she wasn't a person who arrived at not yet by accident. Sergeant Halden requested permission to lead a re-entry team at 1730. I told him no. I told him no because the hostile presence was still active, because the tactical picture wasn't complete, and because sending 6 men back into a structure that had already chewed them up once that day on insufficient intelligence was how I ended up with 6 more names on the wrong side of a ledger. He accepted this, like he didn't sleep. I know because I didn't sleep either, and I could hear him pacing on the other side of the command tent partition with the specific rhythm of a man who has decided that motion is the only alternative to thoughts he doesn't want to have. 3 steps. Turn. 3 steps. In turn. I drank my coffee. I wrote in my notebook, Day 1, 2,200 hours. Echo Niner structure stable, no egress activity, Voss thermal stationary since 1400. Hostile movement, eastern section, probable defensive consolidation. Assessment, she's waiting for something, and question, what? Then I wrote, underneath that, because I couldn't help it, because it's the thing I keep doing. Question, what would I wait for? At 02:15 on day 2, the thermal imaging showed that the 4 Vantage signatures in the eastern section had rearranged. Look, 3 were horizontal, sleeping. 1 was moving, slowly, toward the facility's northern access point, which we assessed as a sentry rotation. Standard, predictable. The kind of pattern a unit falls into when they've controlled a space long enough to stop worrying about it. The stationary signature in the sublevel was gone. I was out of my cot before I'd consciously processed the data. I'm a person who moves slowly and deliberately, and I was at the imagery console in approximately 4 seconds with my notebook. My cold coffee and I stared at the thermal feed, and I thought several things in rapid succession. The first thing was, she moved. The second thing was, where? The third thing, which arrived not as a thought but as a physical sensation somewhere behind my sternum, was, oh, the structure had 8 partial cover positions. She had mapped them. She had logged them. And 4 days before this mission, she had walked through that building and written down every wall thickness, every shadow, every rusted gap in every sheeted surface. And she had handed that document to me, and I'd read it and filed it and used it for planning, and it hadn't occurred to me until this moment at 02:15 on day 2 that she had given herself that document on purpose. That she had been in some part of her operational mind preparing for exactly this. Not this, namely, but something like this. The contingency. The moment when, look, the exit closes and the radio dies and the math becomes just you and the building and what you already know. She hadn't been hiding in that sub-level. She'd been reading the building. The sentry went down at 02:40, not killed. The drone imaging showed the vantage patrol moving from active to inactive over approximately 90 seconds, then a lateral drag into a doorway, then stillness. We debated for 6 minutes what this meant before Corporal Ruiz, who had been at the imagery console since I'd arrived and hadn't moved and hadn't spoken, and whose knuckles were going white on the edge of the table, said very quietly, "She took him down. She took his radio." I looked at the imaging. The 3 horizontal signatures in the eastern section hadn't moved. "She's not going for the exit," Esteban said. "No," I said. "She's going further in." I wrote in my notebook, 0240. VOS active, sentry neutralized, heading interior. Assessment, she's isn't extracting. I stopped. I looked at what I'd written. I finished the sentence. She's doing something else entirely. I did not sleep on day 2. Neither did Halden, neither did Osei, who had taken up a position near the imagery console, with the blanched, watching look of someone witnessing a thing they can't categorize. The rest, of the squad rotated through in the way soldiers do. Brief collapse, a brief waking, present when called. But they all found reasons to be near the monitoring station. They all found reasons to watch. Plus, at 0410, the thermal showed one of the 3 sleeping vantage signatures become active. At 0412, it became inactive again. At 0619, the second one went the same way. By 0800 on day 2, 2 of 3 vantage combatants in the eastern section had been neutralized by something moving through the facility with a patience that the imaging data described as almost architectural, deliberate, and unhurried. Each takedown separated by enough time that the others had gone back to sleep. She wasn't fighting her way through, she was scheduling it. Corporal Ruiz had stopped speaking entirely by this point. He was just watching the screen with his fist against his jaw. And I recognized the expression on his face. Because it's the expression a person wears when they're updating the model they've built of someone they know, and the update is significant. We had left her there, which all of us had, in our various ways, made the calculation. Even those of us who hadn't been in the building. Who'd been sitting in command tents, drinking bad coffee and writing in notebooks. We had all made the calculation that 72 hours is a long time and that the math might not favor her. The thermal imaging at 0800 on day 2 suggested that she had made a different calculation, and hers was better. At 1340, look, the last vantage thermal signature in the facility went inactive. 1 combatant unaccounted for. Assumed egressed through the compromised north wall based on a single moment of exterior movement our perimeter drone caught at 1217, a figure running, not looking back. I looked at the perimeter footage for a long time. The actually running figure had dropped something. Small, rectangular, gone into the, to be fair, scrub without it. I wrote, 1,340, facility clear, plus single hostile egress confirmed, north perimeter 1217. Item dropped at egress point. Nature, unknown. Then I looked at what I'd written. And then I looked at the last thermal signature visible in the facility. It was moving toward the main entrance, slowly, which carrying something that registered warm. Several somethings. She came through the main entrance of the facility in a crouch that straightened as she cleared the threshold. The crouch being tactical, and the straightening being something else, something involuntary. The body remembering what upright means when it no longer has to be afraid of sight lines. She was carrying 2 assault rifles that weren't hers. A tactical vest, also not hers, hung from one hand, field stripped and refolded in a way I'd never seen anyone do in the field. Pressed into a compact rectangle like she'd been a soldier so long she'd learned origami as a subcategory. Honestly, a radio. Vantage make. Functional, based on the fact that it was clipped to her shoulder instead of discarded. Her own weapon, was slung. Both mags loaded, which meant I stopped that thought before I finished it. She stood at the facility entrance for 15 seconds, looking at nothing, looking at the distance between the building and the perimeter, which was 240 meters of open ground. Then she walked it. Well, not jogging, not scanning, plus walking like a person who has finished a thing and is now in the transitional state between what they were doing and what comes next. And that transitional state requires an ordinary activity like crossing a field. The rifles made the walk look strange from the drone feed, asymmetrical, weighted wrong. But she compensated for it the way she compensated for everything, automatically, her body doing the math her brain had moved past. Our perimeter sentry, Private Dominguez, 22 years old, first deployment. It's a kid who collected vintage bus tokens and told everyone about it. Saw her at approximately 400 meters out and did something I've never seen a sentry do in 14 months. He just stood up and stood up from his position, not raising a weapon. I guess, not calling it in. Plus, just stood up, like his body had decided that what it was seeing required him to be vertical, required him to occupy his full height in the presence of whatever was walking toward him. Dominguez called it in at 13:49. He said, "Sir, plus, she's coming in. She's carrying their stuff." I should tell you what she looked like. I won't get it right, but I'll tell you what I wrote down, because what I wrote down is the closest thing I've to the truth of that moment. 1,352. Voss in perimeter. Cuts to face, left cheekbone. Right sleeve, dark, old. Plus, moving under own power. Carrying, 2 rifles to be fair. Vantage designation, 1 vest, Vantage, 1 radio, Vantage. Expression. I stopped writing. I wrote, expression, present, which that was the only word that was accurate. She was present for what it's worth, in the way that a person is present after they've been required, by circumstances, to be nothing but present for 72 consecutive hours. No lag, no processing. She looked at things, and the looking arrived immediately, no travel time, direct from eye to assessment to action. That's the whole middle part of human cognition that usually runs in the background, just visible. I mean running visibly, like watching a machine operate with its casing removed. She sort of walked into the operations area, and the squad was there, and the squad had been there since 0240 in various configurations of awake and watching, and now they were all awake and standing, and nobody moved. She looked at them, they looked at her. She set the Vantage rifles down on the equipment table with a sound that was very specific. Not a slam, not a careful placement, something in. Between, the sound you know, of a thing being set down by a person who has carried it long enough that the setting down has its own weight to it. Then she set down the vest. Then the radio. She looked at the equipment table for a moment. Sergeant First Class Halden was standing 4 feet to her left, and he opened his mouth and I watched him decide, twice, what to say. And both times the decision failed before the words formed, and so he closed his mouth and stood there with the look of a man who has been very certain about something for a long time and has just watched that certainty lift off the ground and leave the building. What she said was, "Your radio's fried." She was looking at Corporal Ruiz. "I'd to ditch it before I took the sentry, left it in the sub-level, which I'll log the grid." Ruiz said something. I did not actually. I catch it. My pen was moving and I missed it. What I did not miss was what she said next. She said it to nobody in particular, said it to the equipment table or the tent wall or the air in the space between all of them, and her voice was the same voice it always was, economical, no room for soft, but underneath it, running at a frequency that wasn't quite audible, something with teeth. Somebody should have come back. Then she picked up her own weapon from her shoulder and walked past all of them toward the medical station. The debrief request landed on my desk at 1600. I looked at it for 40 minutes before I started filling it out. The formal version of what had happened in Echo Niner facility over 72 hours looked, on paper, like a sequence of tactically logical events. Isolated soldier, hostile consolidation, hostile neutralization, egress. Clean lines. For subject survived, hostile element eliminated, mission-adjacent intelligence gathered via acquisition of enemy equipment and communications hardware. The formal version did not contain the part where she lay in a sub-level for 6 hours, reading the structure around her like a text she needed to memorize. It did not contain the detail, which she delivered in the follow-up assessment 2 days later, flat and factual, and in a tone that suggested she was reporting the weather. That she had spent those 6 hours not just waiting, but inventorying. Every sound, pretty much. Every footfall pattern. Every shift change. She had, in my opinion, built a map of their movements from audio alone, lying in the dark, under a concrete floor with a damaged radio she couldn't use, and she had used that map to schedule what came next. The formal version did not contain the part where she told the medical officer, who was trying to document her injuries and kept asking how she was doing fine. She was tired. Could they do this faster? The formal version wasn't the version I was trying to write. The version I was trying to write didn't have a form. I need to tell you about the third Vantage combatant, the one who ran, because Voss told me about him in the follow-up assessment and I'm still turning it over. He was the last one in the facility, and the others had been neutralized in sequence over the 48 hours prior, taken down in their sleep, in their rotations, in the quiet architectural patience of someone who had decided that patience was the most lethal thing she had. But this one, the third one, he'd been awake when she came for him. He'd seen her. She had been in the facility for 68 hours at this point. She hadn't eaten. Plus, she had maybe 2 hours of actual sleep. The rest was the micro-rest of a body running on cortisol and willpower and whatever Dara Voss had instead of a breaking point. She had neutralized 2 trained combatants using nothing but positioning and timing and the specific brutality of choosing the exact right moment. She was carrying their gear because she had made the decision, at some hour in the dark that she later described as the 4th or 5th night. I lost track. Yeah, there was only one night, but it was very long. That she wasn't leaving without proof of what had happened in that building. Evidence, accountability in her arms. She was carrying it out for reasons she did not explain, and I did not ask about because some reasons live below the level of language and you learn to recognize them by shape. The third one saw her and he ran. She could look, have stopped him. I asked, in the follow-up assessment, carefully, why she hadn't. She looked at me for a moment in that way she had, the direct, no travel time looking, and she said, "He dropped the radio when he ran." I wrote that down. "That's the radio I needed," she said, "the one with the encryption keys still in it. He dropped it to run faster." I kept writing. She waited. "Did you want pretty much him for something?" she asked. "Not hostile, genuinely asking. Like the idea that he might have had some other value hadn't occurred to her, and she was willing to update her accounting if it had. "No," I said. "Okay." She looked at the table. I looked, for what it's worth, at the table. "The radio works," she said. "I'd time to figure it out while I was waiting for the extraction window. The encryption is, I can brief the signals team if they want to exploit it." I said that would be very helpful. She nodded. She stood up. Plus, she was moving toward the tent exit when I said her name, because there was something I needed to say, and I wasn't going to write it down. She stopped. "Sergeant Halden," I kind of said. "The decision he made." She was quiet for a moment. "It was a bad situation," she said, which, not defending him, not absolving him, just stating a condition, and yes, bad situations make bad options. "Yes." She was quiet again. "He basically should have come back," she said. "That's still true." She walked out. I finished Notebook 2 at 0300 on the morning after her extraction and started Notebook 3. I've a thing about starting new notebooks at significant junctures. It's the only superstition I allow myself, and even calling it a superstition is generous. It's just that I like the clean page to mean something. I like to mark the before and after with a different spine. Notebook 3 starts with the following entry. Day 3. Post-extraction, 0300. Well, which facility? Echo Niner, cleared. Hostile element, neutralized -1 egress. Sergeant D. Voss, extracted under own power, walking, carrying items per attached equipment log. Status, present, and I wrote present again. I meant it the same way. There's an inquiry. Of course there's. Sergeant First Class Halden will face a formal board review for the egress decision. The inquiry will examine the chain of command, the radio failure, the exact words exchanged before the retreat. And it will, to be fair, weigh the survival of 5 soldiers against the abandonment of 1. It will produce a document that fits everything into appropriate boxes and provides a conclusion. The conclusion will be something everyone can point to and say, "That's what happened. That's what it means." I'll submit 60 pages of debrief notes, and I'll answer every question. I'll write in my opinion, Voss, stationary, sub-level one more time, in another context, for another audience. The inquiry won't ask about the thing that I keep returning to, which isn't the abandonment, not the survival, and not even the operational brilliance of what she did in that building for 72 hours. It won't ask about the walk, the 240 meters of open field, walking, not running, plus carrying their gear and walking because she was done running, or maybe because she had never run. Maybe she had been the one thing in that entire operation that hadn't run. Some that had held its position and reoriented and come out the other side with evidence and a working communications intercept and the specific posture of a person who had been required to become fundamental. Dominguez, the perimeter sentry, the kid who collects bus tokens, told me the next day that when he saw her at 400 meters, he thought, for a moment, before he recognized her, before the recognition landed, that she looked like the field itself had decided to stand up and walk. I didn't write, I guess, that down, and I'm writing it now. Private Osei asked me 2 days after the extraction what it meant. He asked in the way that young soldiers ask things, sideways while looking at something else, as if the question is lighter if it's not aimed directly. He was cleaning pretty much, his weapon, and he said, "How does someone do that, sir? How do you just stay?" I thought about the answer for a while. I thought about the sub-level and the 6 hours and the sound map she built in the dark. I thought about the 4-day-old field notes she'd written as insurance. I thought about somebody should have come back delivered to the equipment table. I thought about the walk. Some people, I said, have already survived the thing that's supposed to break them, a long time before you meet them. So when the new version of the thing shows up, I stopped. Osei was waiting. "They recognize it," I said. "Oh, it's not new. It's familiar, and familiar things, even hard ones, don't take as much of you." He thought about that for a moment. What broke her? He asked. I didn't know. I don't know. There's a before Voss that I've no access to, a history that exists in the two-word spaces she doesn't explain, the blood money she doesn't mention, the long nights she doesn't describe. Whatever it was that she had already survived before I ever met her in a tactical planning session, reading her own field notes back to me with a voice that had learned not to go soft. That's hers, I said. He nodded, and he went back to cleaning his weapon. Halden came to my tent the night before the inquiry opened. He stood in the entrance. And he didn't sit down. He looked like a man who had been trying to find the precise location of the thing that needed to be said and kept missing it by small margins. Is she for what it's worth, all right? He said. It wasn't basically quite a question. She's been debriefed, I said. She's operational. That's not what I asked. I looked at him. I don't know, I said, which was the look, honest answer, and which was the answer I wouldn't be putting in any document. She had come out of that building, walking and present and carrying the evidence of what she'd done, and she had said somebody should have come back to a room full of people who hadn't come back, and then she had walked to the medical station and let them tend to the cut on her cheek and the dark stain on her sleeve, and she had eaten one full meal and slept 6 hours and been back at the assessment table the next morning in the exact same posture she always occupied. Upright, precise, present. See, the voice not going soft. I did not know if she was all right. I knew she was functional. I knew she was effective. I knew that somewhere under the functionality and the effectiveness, there was a person who had done something that should not have been necessary and who would carry it. Not as trauma, not as pride, but as fact. The way you carry a heavy object that has permanently altered the muscle structure of the arm that carried it. Sort of, you put it down. The arm is different. She'll be fine, I said, because Halden needed something to stand on, and it wasn't a lie exactly. He nodded. He left. I've one more kind of thing to say about the equipment. The 2 Vantage rifles she carried out were logged, photographed, and transferred to intelligence for assessment. The vest went the same route. The radio became the most productive single piece of intelligence captured in that operational theater in 4 months. The encryption keys she'd extracted gave the signals team access to 6 weeks of communication metadata, which produced 3 subsequent interdictions that I'm not at liberty to discuss, and which Voss isn't credited for in any document I've submitted because she asked me, when she handed me the radio in the follow-up, to log it as a field recovery. On field recovery, like she'd found it on the ground. I asked why. She looked at me with the no-travel time eyes. It was in the field, she said. I recovered it. I wrote it down the way she asked. It bothers me. Not because I, to be fair, think she was being modest. False modesty requires the presence of ego, and Voss operated in a register that was past ego, past the place where the distinction between I did this and this was done matters. She wasn't erasing herself. She was being precise. She had been in the field. She had recovered a thing. These were facts. Plus, the facts didn't require her name attached to them to remain true. But I keep thinking about the 6 men who won't have her name attached to the story either, who will give their accounts to the inquiry board, and the accounts will be the facts of the night, the radio failure, the egress decision, the fire at the South Channel, and none of the accounts will contain the fact that they left and she didn't. And not in those words, not in words that stay. She came back with their gear. They'll receive it as equipment, log entries. That's the part I can't put in the notebook, the part that doesn't compress into a specific time and a precise notation. It's not grief exactly, and it's not anger. It's for what it's worth, the thing that lives between those two. And the thing that doesn't have a word yet because language was built by people who mostly manage not to be in places like Echo Niner, and so the gaps in the language fall exactly where the weight is. I'm on Notebook 3 now. The first entry is still the one I mean most. Status, present. She tapped, actually, the top of her helmet before she went into the medical tent, 2 fingers. I saw it from across the operations area. Dominguez saw it too. He was nearby and he watched it, and then he looked at me with the question on his face. What does that mean that young soldiers carry constantly and should never be talked out of? I didn't answer it. Some things she does belong to her. But I wrote it down. 1,354. Plus, Voss, pre-entry medical, 2-finger tap. Honestly, helmet, crown, calibrating. To be fair, she walked in. The tent flap closed. Somewhere in the signals tent, Agatek was powering up the Vantage radio for the first time, about to find 6 weeks of encrypted communications that nobody expected to find, that would ripple forward into 3 interdictions, and then into other things I can't trace, and possibly into things that haven't happened yet. Things that live downstream of a woman lying in a sub-level in the dark, listening, mapping, deciding what kind of patience wins. The tent flap didn't move. I finished my coffee, which I opened notebook 3 to page 2.